Senate President Cheese Escudero takes oath as the presiding officer of the impeachment trial of Vice President Sara Duterte. This trial could have far-reaching consequences, says global CEO advisory firm Teneo. The context and analysis from Managing Director Bob Herrera Lim. Philippine stocks and bond yields up, the peso stronger heading into the second half. We get the lowdown on the technical charts with Ron Acoba of Trading Edge. And in news overseas, top officials from the US and China are set to meet for the second day of trade talks in London. The Senate is moving forward with the impeachment trial of Vice President Sara Duterte, with Senator judges taking their oaths today, June 10th at 4 p.m. Senate President Cheese Escudero took oath last night as presiding officer of the Impeachment Court. The trial proceedings will begin tomorrow, June 11th. Escudero's taking of oath came after hours of debate on whether to immediately convene as an impeachment court. Senators clashed over the timing, specifically the interpretation of the word forthwith in the Constitution. Minority Leader Coco Pimentel and Senator Risa Ontiveros argued it meant the trial should begin without delay.
Hindi po mahirap intindihin ang utos sa sino mang tapat ang intensyong sundin ito. Ang paglilitis ay dapat agarang simulan, nang walang pag-iwas o iba pang pagpapaliban.
According to the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, forthwith means without any delay or without interval of time.
However, other senators, including Alan Peter Cayetano, questioned that interpretation, saying forthwith does not necessarily mean right away. Meanwhile, Senator Raffy Tulfo attempted to break the impasse by proposing a vote.
Para nag-aaway na tayo dito. To solve the impasse siguro, we'll have to put it in a vote, whether to convene today or tomorrow. Magbutuhan na lang tayo para matapos na.
Senator Joel Villanueva clarified last night the Senate would only be constituted but not yet convened as a court. Senators agreed to formally convene as an impeachment court on June 11th. With us now for context and analysis from the perspective of Frisk, we're joined by global consulting firm Managing Director Bob Herrera Lim. Good to see you again. Welcome back to the program, Bob.
Good morning, Cathy.
All right, so the Senate impeachment trial is going to be convened tomorrow. What are the scenarios that you're considering at this point?
Okay, so I think a couple of things. The first thing is, I don't think it's very likely that they'll hold the continuous trial that some sectors have been advocating. They might make a show of starting it just so that it's in the records and it happens. That's what the people or the politicians who would like Sara's trial to continue would like to happen. The second is the Senate gets bogged down on the question of whether or not they can continue as an impeachment court beyond June the 30th. And that's those two issues. Those two questions are going to be debated ferociously over the next few days. The outcome is not clear on what side they will come out on. So really the scenario is one of continuing uncertainty for the near term about where all of this is going, whether it's on the procedural matters in the next few days or the long-term outlook for Vice President Sara Duterte and the Marcos administration.
And that uncertainty is cause for concern for the CEOs and senior leaders that you advise. What is definite in your view is the outcome of this week's Senate debates, because it could influence what you say is the political outlook for the next 3 years. But how so?
Yeah, so if it doesn't go to trial, let's say it is dismissed this week by the Senate, then there will be a strong sense that Sara Duterte remains a powerful force in Philippine politics and that the Duterte family remains a powerful force in politics that has to be reckoned with, because that is the reason the Senate or senators will vote against continuing her trial, which means that you would basically see the two most powerful or prominent families in the country standing opposed to each other. I do not think there will be any reconciliation between them. So Marcos has to deal with sort of the sword hanging over him of a Duterte succession. Now, on the other hand, if the trial does continue, obviously there will be the question of whether the impeachment trial will find Sara Duterte guilty, but it could be very damaging for her because all the allegations about corruption, misuse of funds, whether true or not, could come out. And it could damage the Duterte family brand where she becomes less viable as a candidate in 2028. So I think whatever happens in the next 2 to 3 weeks will have a definite effect on Philippine politics 2 to 3 years out even.
Well, given the extent of the impact, what kind of strategic counsel then are you now providing the CEOs and the senior executives, given what we know now and that we have yet to ascertain?
Okay. Our view is twofold. First of all, you have a lot of uncertainty. It's not just the Philippine uncertainty, right? It's the uncertainty on the tariffs, it's the uncertainty on the global trade front, and what happens on all of these combined. So our counsel right now is one of course, risk always exists. You cannot avoid it. But the challenge is therefore to identify the risk scenarios and to find out how these scenarios could affect your planning. And I think right now, the main advice we give, especially those investing in the Philippines, is there are bad outcomes, right? There are outcomes where we can have some instability, but there are decent outcomes. As we saw in the midterms, there was sort of a fundamental protest vote against the binary formulation of Philippine politics, against the politics being defined simply as Marcos versus Duterte. And we've discussed the possibility of a third force coming in, a force that says it's not just about the politics of Marcos versus Duterte. It could be about improving governance because some people might be fed up with just simply politics about these two families. So there is a silver lining in the clouds, which we have to wait, evolve, and which might become more visible over the next 2-3 months. So again, our advice to CEOs, our advice to investors is keep doing your business as you've been doing it. Watch out for the risky scenarios, but at the same time, do not disregard the possibility that you might see at least a less potent or less, shall we say, divided politics, maybe 6 months to a year from now, depending on what happens in the next 2 to 3 months.
When you say keep doing what you're doing right now, does that mean expanding CapEx or maybe waiting and seeing what happens next?
Yeah, no. I think the view here is you have a baseline view if you're a CEO, right, on how the economy might grow. The biggest worry for many CEOs is if let's say Sara, in the scenario that Sara rises as a political force, does the Duterte family go after some of the allies of the Marcos family? And if that's the case, and you're a business that's seen as being part of what Duterte has railed against in the past, the oligarchy, or Marcos allies, does that make you more careful? I think if you're one of these families, if you're one of these business groups, you have to watch the trials going on, because if the probability of a Duterte return increases, then that uncertainty for you increases. This is independent, of course, of whether or not Duterte is right or wrong, or whether or not the charges against him or her, him when I refer to the president in The Hague, are correct. But definitely the Dutertes are outsiders to the elite politics of the country. And you might see, and whenever an outsider threatens the established or entrenched order, it's always a risk for the people who are in power or their close allies.
Just as a final point, the global trade policy uncertainty, where does that play out then in these level of risks that we just mentioned?
Nothing is certain yet on what will happen with global trade, right? Everyone's waiting for what happens with China, and then everyone's waiting for July 9th. Everyone's waiting for the bigger economies. There is very, very little or no certainty yet on where trade policy might fall. Obviously, we've heard the baseline is maybe we get to 10% to 15% tariffs at the end of the day, because anything beyond that is just too painful for the world. But that's an uncertain call. That's an uncertain outcome yet, and it'll probably take 2 to 3 months more. And then finally, there's the question of if tariffs resume, what effect does that have on U.S. consumption? What effect does that have on the Chinese economy? There are still many, many effects that we're waiting for. So that, for me, is the bigger uncertainty.
So many questions yet to be answered, but thank you for giving us a certainty amid the uncertainty. Bob Lim of Teneo. And you're watching Money Talks. Coming right up, second day of talks between the U.S. and China takes place in London. And U.S. President Donald Trump deploys more troops in L.A. amid immigration protests. Keep it here on One News. will meet for the second day of trade talks in London, as U.S. President Trump said he is receiving good reports on the state of negotiations. U.S. delegates expect that the talks would prompt China to ease export controls on rare earth magnets, a crucial component in producing electric vehicle motors and military equipment. Attending the talks on the U.S. side are Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and Trade Representative Jameson Greer. The Chinese delegation consists of Vice Premier He Lifeng, Commerce Minister Wang Wentao, and Chief Trade Negotiator Li Chenggang. Monitoring developments in the White House, Trump struck a tone of optimism as both sides seek to diffuse trade tensions.
We are doing well with China. They're over there now. I'm only getting good reports. It's a little early, but they'll be calling in soon. We want to open up China. And if we don't open up China, maybe we won't do anything.
Lift export controls when it comes to China? Did you give your negotiators any sort of limitations?
We're going to see. Look.
Meantime, China's exports in May rose year-on-year by 4.8%, shy of Reuters' estimates of 5%. Customs data also showed imports plunging last month by 3.4% from a year earlier, missing economists' expectations of 0.9%. China's shipments to the U.S. dropped to 34.5%, the sharpest fall since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Analysts said while the skyrocketing tariffs were lifted mid-May, their effects have already kicked in. The truce between the world's superpowers is expected to reflect on China's June trade data. U.S. markets made modest gains as U.S.-China trade talks in London kicked off. The Dow traded nearly flat, losing a single point. The S&P 500 ticked up by nearly 0.1%, and the Nasdaq rose by 1/3%. Benchmark 10-year Treasury yield settled to 4.481%, and gold prices slightly inched up to $3,332 per troy ounce. U.S. futures pointing to slight gains when the markets open later tonight Manila time. The Dow and the S&P rising by about 0.1%, and the Nasdaq up 0.25%. As for Asian markets, they're rising in the first hour of trading this Tuesday as investors await more details in the U.S.-China trade talks entering a second day. Australia's ASX 200 returns from the holiday up over 0.5%. South Korea's Kospi climbs by over 0.3%, and Japan's Nikkei 225 gains 0.5%. Let's get a quick check on our markets this Tuesday and see how they're trading at the get-go. The Philippine Stock Exchange Index opens today 6,403, and that's about a decline of 0.1% at the get-go in the first 15 minutes of trading. PSEI started the shortened trading week with a gain of nearly 0.5%. Local counters were a mixed bag, with holding firms and services leading those gains, mining and oil leading the losses. Let's take a look at the Philippine peso, see how that's going since 8 a.m. today. 55.75 to the dollar. Peso closed yesterday weaker at 55.81 against the greenback. As for the Philippine 10-year government bonds, they've inched up to 6.3% from the previous close of 6.279%. So what do the technical charts say about where to invest next in the Philippine markets? With us now for more is Ron Acoba, the Chief Investment Strategist at Trading Edge Consultancy. Good to see you, Ron. Welcome back to the program.
Hi, Ms. Cathy. Good morning.
All right.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, second half of the year, and we're looking at a near 3% decline on the PSEI index, and that's after a whole lot of event risks, if you will. The April 2 Liberation Day tariffs, one Bangko Sentral policy rate cut last April 10th, the Philippine midterm elections on May 12th, peso strength. So what did the chart say about how the PSEI traded, where it's going to go next in the second half this year?
Well, as you've mentioned, the PSEI on a year-to-date basis is down by close to 3%. If you look at it in the bigger picture, the index has been trading in a sideways pattern, not just over the last few months, but in fact over the last 4 to 5 years, between its low of around 5.8 to a high of around 7,500. So it's just been trading range bound between those two key levels. So it's not to say though that funds are not deploying their cash. It's just that they're not really keen on on deploying it on a broad-based basis, hence the flat performance of the index. So, which goes to your question, where do we invest now? Where do we invest now, and how do we invest? Now, there are very noticeable performers on selected names. These are the likes, for example, of Meralco, Manila Water, Converge ICT, ICTSI, APX, and of course, DG Plus. The common denominator among them is double-digit earnings growth. So while the rest of the market have been performing rather poorly or underwhelmingly, there are certain industries, or there are certain companies that have performed really well, and these are the ones that are really backed by robust earnings growth. And it's quite obvious that a lot of these funds have been putting a lot of money in those particular names.
Not so obvious ones. I mean, you've monitored one stock here closely.
Yeah.
SDI Education Systems Holdings.
Yes.
Fundamentally
Yes,
looking
yes.
supportive. I was looking at its earnings, 9-month income surging, 45%, more students enrolling in its schools. What's going on though technically?
Well, before we go into the technicals, you've touched upon its fundamentals. Over the last 3 years, SDI Education have had a compound annual earnings growth rate of around 54%. Imagine that, 54% earnings growth in the last 3 years, every year. In the last year alone, last school year alone, the company posted a significant earnings growth of 84%. For the present year, it's slated to post an increase of 34% in earnings. So, and even with that, the stock is only trading at what? 8 times PE. So it's growing at a very high clip, and its valuation, even if it is now trading at a 7-year high, it's still very much undervalued with a forward PE of just 8 times. So there's a lot of upside given the fact that it's slated to grow by another 34% this year, and slated to grow by double digit again in the next 2 to 3 years. Technically, though, going to its charts, recently it's able to surpass its key resistance at 1.5 decisively with increased market participation. It's now trading at a new 7-year high. With that, it's positioned to revisit its all-time high at around 1.8 to 1.3. Not just revisit, but even surpass, given the fact that, as I've mentioned, it's growing its earnings at a very high clip as of late.
Well, let's take a look at some of the cross bears here. Pretty interesting that our local currency has strengthened to 3.6% versus the dollar since the start of this year. So what does that tell us of where the peso is headed next in the second half?
Well, moving forward, firstly, technically speaking, the exchange rate is now hovering above its 18-month key support at around 55.3 thereabouts. In the past few weeks, the stock has the exchange rate has just been moving sideways, but with the BSP position to cut its interest rate in June 19, given the fact that domestic inflation has eased to 1.3% from 1.4% in the prior month, and with BSP potentially cutting, the interest rate differential with the US and the Philippines will narrow from 100 basis points to around 75 basis points, assuming the BSP cuts by 25%. That will actually weaken the peso. Hence, we will most likely see a rally in the US dollar peso exchange rate in the very near term. So there's a divergence between policies. The Fed is maintaining a wait and see mode. They will likely cut by September, not as early as June or July, while the BSP is already keen in cutting. So there's that divergence in policy, which will lead to a likely weakness in the peso in the very near term. Right. Overall, though, on a bigger picture, though, trend is still in favor of the peso, and a potential decline below the 55.3 support will likely lead it to its next support at 54 54.3, 54.2.
Now, how does that relate, Ron, with the bond yields? Because we've been looking at the divergence and potential decoupling. That word has often been said on this show. 10-year bond yield has really been confined to a narrow range of between 6.11 to 6.33% since reaching the peak on January 17th. That's a time Trump inaugurated on January 20th. How's it done since, and in correlation with the U.S. 10-year Treasury yields?
Well, if you look at the domestic peso bond yield over the last 3 to 4 years, it's just been trading sideways between around 6.2 to around 6.5 trading range bond in that particular trading band. It's basically stuck in that particular range because of the fact that the U.S. yields have also been stuck around 4.3, 4.4 over the past several months. If you recall, yields in the U.S. actually at one point spiked because of the credit rating downgrade. It was the news like a week or 2 weeks ago. So with U.S. yields stuck at a high clip of around 4.5 at 4 to 4.5 at present, it's likely that the domestic yields will also be stuck at this particular range.
All right,
even if the BSP is set to cut its interest rate, because as you know, U.S. remains to be the Philippines benchmark.
That's true, and we're watching and waiting for the Bangko Central's decision on June 19th. Then, well, thank you so much for providing that context and via charts. Very important on the data dive. Ron Acoba of Trading Edge. And coming up, Apple releases a new design for its latest software. Keep it here on One News. You're watching Money Talks here in One News. In corporate news, Emperador Inc. has earmarked 4 billion pesos for capital expenditure this year to boost production capacity. This is lower than the 6.5 billion pesos capex in 2024. The whiskey and brandy producer says it will use the capex for the ongoing expansion of its Dalmore distillery in Olney, Scotland, which is set to be completed in the second half. The firm is also doubling the size of its whiskey maturation complex in Invergordon in 92 hectares. Emperador Chairman and President Winston Goss says this is seen to double the brand's production capacity, adding it is part of their long-term efforts to meet rising global demand. Double Dragon Corp's Hotel 101 Madrid has been named the official hotel partner of the Formula One Spanish Grand Prix. The company, led by tycoons Edgar Injap, Sia and Second, and Tony Tan Kakyong, signed the 10-year deal with Match Hospitality, the event's official hospitality provider. Hotel 101 Madrid, set to open late this year, will serve VIP guests for the race from 2026 to 2035. This marks Hotel 101 Global's first venture in Europe, with future sites planned in Japan and the U.S., all part of its goal to reach 1 million rooms in 100 countries. Here are the headlines. headlines from around the globe. In the U.S., U.S. President Trump has deployed 700 Marines to Los Angeles to protect federal property, a move that California Governor Gavin Newsom described as a provocation. The president activated 2,000 National Guards over the weekend to quell what he deemed as an act of rebellion as protests erupt over his immigration crackdown. He labeled demonstrators as insurrectionists, which could pave the way for Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act. The 1807 law allows troops to directly take part in law enforcement. So far, only 300 guards are on the ground, but Newsom said Trump has sent 2,000 more troops to LA in what the former lamented as pointless. California officials have already sued the Trump administration for deploying guards without following the legal process. In Ukraine and Russia, both countries exchanged prisoners of war under the age of 25, one of the biggest prisoner swaps since the war started 3 years ago. The return of prisoners is one of the few things both sides have agreed during the direct talks in Turkey last week, as broader negotiations have failed to end the war. The exchange comes as Russia claimed its forces had taken control of more territory in Ukraine's eastern region. Kiev added Moscow had launched its largest drone attack of the war, with Russian forces deploying 479 drones and 20 missiles to Ukraine. And Apple has unveiled a new design for the software powering iPhones, iPads, and Macs called Liquid Glass, diverging from the major tech companies investing their energies in AI. The company has also changed the naming system for its software based on fiscal year, with this year's version now called iOS 26. Meanwhile, Apple's promise of an improved Siri virtual assistant would likely be launched later this year, prompting concerns from Wall Street that the company could stumble in the AI race. Apple is confronting a host of challenges, including Trump's tariffs and the Epic Game lawsuit. Its shares fell more than 1% after the event. Filipino Americans scored big at the Tony Awards on Sunday, June 8th, an historic night with 3 wins by Philams in major categories. Nicole Scherzinger won the Best Performance by an actress in a leading role in a musical for her take on Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard, which also bagged Best Revival. The former Pussycat Dolls frontwoman said she is honored as a little Hawaiian Ukrainian Filipino girl while paying tribute to her fellow nominees. Darren Criss made history as the first Philam to clinch the Tony Awards Best Performance by an actor in a leading role in a musical for Maybe Happy Ending. The actor also won a Golden Globe Award for a limited series in 2019. Meanwhile, Marco Paglia earned not only 1 but 2 Tonys for the musical Buena Vista Social Club. These are the best orchestrations in a special Tony Award for the band. The Philam Maestro serves as a music director, conductor, and is also on piano on stage. 3 Filipinos in one go there. Congratulations! That is it for Money Talks. I'm Cathy Yang. Catch us again tomorrow, 9:30 a.m. here on One News. Have a great day ahead.